All right, this evening's Torah portion is Beshalach, and it's after he had let go, and we pick up the story of God's people leaving Egypt, right? We've gone through the plagues as we talked in Parsha Bo just last week, the last of the plagues, and then Pharaoh essentially kicked the people out of the land. And so they're following the pillar of fire and the pillar of cloud, and they're going, and we come to a situation, several situations in this Torah portion. But what's interesting is, if we look at this Torah portion, we see we have an event and a response, right? And a lot of these center around unity. A lot of these things center around God's people being unified, and then we see where they're disunified, and we see the consequences of that. And we see when we have unity, we see blessing. When we have disunity, we see strife and discord, and a whole host of negative things come into the people's lives. And that's kind of what the theme I want to focus on as we look through this Torah portion this week, is just the idea of unity. There's so much in our world today that is disunified, right? You just turn on the TV, you turn on the news, you look at social media, and what do we see? We see women and men disunified, right? The culture tells the women don't trust men, and tells the men don't trust women. Right? And then what does that do? It erodes the family. Okay? And then we see racial tensions, right? Anytime there's any kind of a racial issue, why is it that they go and they go to extreme lengths to keep that in front of you, keep that negativity in front of you all the time, right? Because if you can get the races to hate each other, you can keep the people disunified. Disunified people are easier to control. And this is what the enemy does to us today. You know? Even amongst people who say we're like-minded, right? We believe the same, but yet what do? We infight over petty doctrines. We infight over different opinions, over peripheral issues. And we can't find unity. And so we're divided. It's important, especially in the days we're in, that we learn to find unity, especially among the brethren. But even with our fellow man, there doesn't always have to be agreement, but we should be able to walk with those that are around us. Right? What the scripture tells us, be at peace as much as is possible with all men. There doesn't have to be agreement, but we don't have to war with each other either. So let's pick up our Torah portion. We are in Exodus chapter 14, actually chapter 13, verse 17 is where we're going to start. And we'll kick into chapter 14 here. So 13:17 says, after Pharaoh had let the people go, God did not guide them to the highway that goes to the land of the Philistines because it was close by. God thought that the people, upon seeing war, might change their minds and return to Egypt. Rather, God led the people by a roundabout route. Through the desert by the sea of Suf, the people of Israel went up from the land of Egypt fully armed. God didn't want the people just coming out of bondage to be faced with war. There's a grace there because you can face only so many traumas, right? They had the trauma of over 400 years of bondage. They had the trauma of essentially, if we put any stock in what the commentators would tell us, they essentially lost their identity, right? They were Israelites in name only, so to speak. Right? They were Jews, Hebrews in name only. They had lost their identity. They were thoroughly engrossed in Egyptian culture and practice. And yet, God pulls them out. He redeems them. He saves them. So God said, I'm not going to put war in front of them. We're going to take a different route. Now, the people were led to Yam Suf, which is right by the Sea of Reeds. That's where their encampment was. Some translations will call it the Red Sea, but the correct translation is the Reed Sea, or Sea of Reeds. And it's interesting to note their encampment was at a place called Baal Zephon, which is actually the name of an Egyptian god. I just learned this week. You know how the plagues, we talk about how the plagues were all putting down all these different Egyptian gods. Well, this encampment, this territory was named after this Baal Zephon, which was an Egyptian idol, and it was known for protecting the maritime trade, right? So this where the ships would come in and trade, and ships would come in, ships would go out, all these kinds of things. And it was also the god of storm. So if you were an Egyptian sailor, you might pray to this god, right? So he would give you safe passage, not throw a big storm up or all these kinds of things. And so that's where the people were encamped. Now, the Israelites were trapped against a sea, against this Reed Sea. And so they had left. Pharaoh decides that he's going to come after them again. Now, what's interesting is we go to chapter 14. We've always talked about this. When you see a pattern of 3 in Scripture, right? As you're reading through a passage and you see through the repetition, right? God wants you to pay attention. There's something notable here. Well, in chapter 14, verse 4, it says, I will make Pharaoh so hard-hearted that he will pursue them. We go down to verse 8. Adonai made Pharaoh hard-hearted. And then if we jump all the way to verse 17. As for me, I will make the Egyptians hard-hearted. The Egyptians had committed to their task. They said, we let the people go. That was probably a big mistake. We are going to get them back. And this wasn't a passive, well, maybe if we can, or, we'll just try it and see how it goes. It said, no, we are all in as a people. We're going to get these people back. We talk about the Israelites being in bondage. As it related to Egypt, they were a viable economic resource, right? Who was building all the buildings? Who was doing all the menial labor? Right? Who was doing all these things? The Israelites were. And it's much, I remember there was what was that meme? I think it was a couple years back. It was like something like a day without a Mexican or something. And they were talking about that, like what would happen if all the Hispanic people left America? Who would do all this kind of work and this and that? Same kind of mindset. And so the Egyptians wanted these people back, and they were committed. And so their heart was hardened. They were unrelenting. They were not going to let them go. And all of a sudden they see, okay, you probably had your spies or whoever following the people, right? I mean, it was a mixed multitude of a lot of people, so it probably wasn't too hard to follow them, see where they were going. And all of a sudden they're trapped, right? They're kind of boxed in. They've got the sea to their back, and then they're facing all of Egypt here. Pharaoh's looking, I got them now. You guys ain't going nowhere. And so now the people they're in a tight spot. Well, we know the miracle. God tells Moses to part the waters, and miraculously, the waters were separated, and the people went across on dry land. Now, this crossing of the waters, we've all heard this story how many times, right? The waters separate, they go across on dry land, the Egyptians follow, and they drown, right? And it's a big celebration, great miracle, right? The people are saved. But we miss this aspect of the crossing of the waters. That's symbolic of two aspects of our faith: salvation and baptism. Their salvation was more than just physical. See, the people passed from fear, I'm stuck between the ocean and a hostile enemy force. I've got nowhere to go. They outnumber us, they're stronger than us. A superior fighting force, we're just a bunch of people, right? We got the sea to our back. Where can we go? And then the waters part. They could have just stood there on the bank looking at the waters. That's weird. I'm not crossing that. I'm not going there. Right? It's unknown. Whoever had seen water do that? And yet here it was. So they had to pass from fear to faith, from bondage to freedom. There's bondage in Egypt, there's freedom, but you got to cross this water. You got to cross this miraculous event. They went from exile to adoption, from death to new life. God took his bride through the waters. It was a cleansing baptism, if you look at it. Just as a bride before her wedding does a mikvah, she cleanses herself to make herself ready, right? So what do we have here? We have the nation, the bride, passes through the waters, a mikvah, a cleansing, to prepare herself to be wed to her husband. And that's what takes place in Mount Sinai, is the wedding, right? Under the hoop of the cloud. So the people were given a spiritual mikvah. Our salvation and deliverance is through Yeshua, for he is our living water. So there's a lot of this context when we pass through the water. We don't want to just be dismissive of this just because we're familiar with it. This was a profound moment. God was cleansing his bride. Now, after all these events, they make it through the other side. The enemy is defeated. And then there's this song, the Song of Moses. And it's kind of like what Mandy shared earlier, right as we were praising and worship. Worship is a key component. A lot of times God does something for us, and that's an opportunity for us to respond in worship. We can just respond and say nothing, or we can respond in worship. Respond in showing gratitude. The Israelites were unified physically as they crossed over. And they were unified spiritually in their corporate worship. So we had a physical unity in the crossing. And then with the response of worship, they were unified spiritually. Remember, we're talking about unity. That's the underlying theme here. Then they come through the wilderness to Shur and to Marah, place of bitterness. And the people grumbled, for the water they found wasn't fit. It wasn't suitable to drink. Another miracle there, with water, again, was that it was made suitable to drink. And during this, they were given laws and rules for life. Let's actually look at that. That's going to be chapter 15, verse 24. It says, the people grumbled against Moses and asked, what are we to drink? Moses cried to Adonai, and Adonai showed him a certain piece of wood, which then he threw into the water and made the water taste good. There Adonai made laws and rules of life for them, and there he tested them. He said, if you will listen intently to the voice of Adonai your God, do what he considers right, pay attention to his mitzvot, and observe his laws. I will not afflict you with any of these diseases I brought upon the Egyptians, because I am Adonai your healer. Now, again, they were unified, right? What's interesting is Midrash says that this water, when they went to Marah, that the water was fine. But why it tasted bitter to them is because they had bitterness in their hearts. That the water became a reflection of what was in them. And that's why it tasted bitter. And that's why they cried out. And God had to show Moses how to transform the water, i.e. transform them, and that's why they were given these laws and rules for life, because that was the transforming agent that would take the bitterness out of their hearts. Interesting concept. But now if we look at these laws and rules of life, right? This is before we have the law from Mount Sinai, before we have the commandments. We're already given some rules. The bride has been saved and redeemed. She's been cleansed. And now the Father is beginning to say, this is how I want you to live with me. This is the kind of behavior that I'm expecting out of this relationship. Because it'll be beneficial for you, it'll be beneficial for me, and it will allow us to be together in a positive way, in a mutually beneficial way. So let's break this down. Exodus 15:26. It says, if you will diligently listen, the first thing we have to do is to humble ourselves in order to hear what God is saying. The understanding is that the voice of the Lord refers not only to the 10 Commandments, but the entirety of his word. Remember, they haven't been given the commandments yet. They're just getting started. God's saying, I'm going to give mitzvot, rules, laws, ordinances. And these are of life. These are for your benefit. It says, if you will do what is right, we know God is right. His children are to be yesharim, those who walk uprightly. You know, if right is yeshur, we are to be yesharim, those who walk uprightly. Known by the good fruit of our lives. Do what is right. And then we know Scripture and the Torah, they go on to extrapolate what is right. Right? You don't get to necessarily decide what is right. God says, I'll tell you what's right. But it's an expectation. Then he says, give ear. We're talking about active listening. A focus to our listening that leads to action. We do not merely hear the truth of his word, but we live it. Right? We've all heard, if you've done any kind of counseling or coaching or any kind of personal development, they always talk about active listening, being an active listener. Right? Don't stare at your wife like a deer in the headlights while she's talking and you haven't heard a word she says, because that makes her very angry.
And we can tell, even though your eyes are looking at us, when they're glossed over, you're not listening.
That's right. It's not active listening. It gets you in trouble.
Your mind is somewhere else.
This is very true. Very true. But we're to be active listeners. So we're supposed to hear, like really hear, understand, internalize it, and then take action on it. Right? Give ear. And then we are to keep his statutes, his mitzvot. Statutes given without an explicit defined reason or explanation should be given the same reverence as those we can comprehend or understand. So basically what's going on here? God's saying, look, I said it. You need to obey it. End of discussion. It's great if you can understand it. It might make it easier for you to accept it. But hey, if you can't understand why he made a particular rule or law, tough. We do the same thing with our kids, right? Sometimes we'll tell our kids, do this or that or the other thing. And well, why? Why do I have to do that? And then maybe if we're feeling gracious, we'll explain it to them, right? Otherwise, sometimes we say, because I said. And that's the end of the story. You don't have to like it. You don't have to understand it. But you better obey it. Because if you don't, there's consequences. This is our Heavenly Father talking. He knows what's best for us. He has our good in his heart and in his mind. There's lots of times we're not going to understand, but we're still expected to obey. And then it closes this passage by saying, we find healing in him. Adonai Rafika, right? The Lord our healer, one of the Hebrew redemptive names of God. We talked about how do you name an infinite God, right? He's infinite. He's outside of space and time and creation. Right? How do you box him in with a name? Well, we know any name we assign to God is really a reflection of his character and his nature and how he interacts with us in that moment. And so this redemptive name, Adonai Rafika, is the Lord our healer. Because that's how in this passage he's relating to us. And he says, these laws of life conclude with a blessing for those who honor them. Namely, protection and healing for those who walk in his ways. Even from a natural perspective, if you were to follow Torah, that would exclude you from a lot of things that go on in this culture. You know, a lot of diseases you're just going to be exempt from because you're not engaging in the behavior that would open you up to receiving that. And so, as we follow his word, as we follow his rules and laws for life, it can be healing to us. We're not engaging in prohibitive activities. We're not putting ourselves in harm's way, as it were. And we're relying on him. You see, we're not saved by keeping his laws. You know, these rules that he's given us, these mitzvot. They don't save us. But that doesn't excuse us from living righteously before him. That does not excuse us from living any old way we want. Remember, the people were already saved. They had been taken out of Egypt. They had passed through the water. That was the salvation and the mikvah, the salvation and the baptism. We're past that point now. So it's not about doing stuff to get saved. You're already saved. But now God is saying, look, I want to have a relationship with you. We got to lay some ground rules. Another look at spiritual unity. Chapter 16. So they're out in the wilderness, and again, the people are complaining. Now this time, it's not water, it's food. So in response to their disunity and their desire for the things of Egypt, the Lord sent manna from heaven. What was their complaint? We don't have any meat. We have no bread and no meat. Man, if we were back in Egypt, we used to sit by the flesh pots, get all the meat, bread we wanted. You got us out here in the wilderness, you know, we're struggling with water, and now there's no bread. So we get manna from heaven. God responds to our need. Now there's an obscure translation, and I apologize, I don't remember who stated this or what language it was from. It's not a Hebraic translation. It might be Arabic, but I'm not 100%. But basically, the word manna is translated as, what is it? Like, what is this stuff? We'll call it, it's manna. It's more of a statement of question. What is that? I thought that was interesting. There's lots of speculation about what manna was, but nobody really knows because we don't have it anymore. Now, it was equated to a fine coriander-like seed, and according to Midrash, again, take this for what it's worth, it's said to have no taste. It's said to have no taste at all. But it was entirely the product of aroma, and we know our taste is linked to our nose, right? How we smell. So it said if a person was righteous, it would taste pleasant. But if they were complaining, it would taste bland. And it kind of goes back to that idea about the water, that the water was just neutral, but because their hearts were bitter, when they drank it, it tasted bitter. Same kind of idea. Now, I thought that was interesting because life is like this, right? If we're living righteously, toward those around us, life is sweet. We love it. We appreciate it. But man, when we're complaining, when we're focusing on the negative all the time, life is just, at best, it's bland, right? Let me just grind through this, get through this week. Got nothing to look forward to. Can't stand everybody around me. Can't stand myself. Right? Complaint. Negativity. Life is just bland. It sucks the passion, the life out of your life. You know, studying this Torah portion has really kind of convicted me about complaining. I'm not exempt from complaining. And I know my wife always reminds me, she's like, you're complaining again. And one of the things that I'm learning is that you open your life up to things when you complain. You really do. Mm-hmm. And we complain about the dumbest stuff. I don't know about you guys. I complain about the dumbest stuff. Right? It's too hot in the house. It's too cold in the house. Right? You can just walk over to the thermostat and change it. The homeless guy is not making that complaint. He's like, wow, you got heat and air conditioning in your house? Right? The person who's living in poverty, they don't have these complaints. You got to eat today? Oh, and you didn't like it? You know, one of the things that I've learned some hard lessons about complaining, when you complain about something, especially a blessing, and we think about this, why would we ever complain about a blessing? Well, with blessings come responsibilities. And so we like to enjoy our blessing, right? Blessed you with that brand new car, right? You got that transportation that you've been wanting and needing, and here it is. Oh, the brakes went out. But you got the money to fix it. You just got to get it done. Oh man, I can't believe this stupid car. Brakes went out. Piece of junk. Right? When you complain about a blessing, God may take that blessing away. Next thing you know, you got a car accident and that blessing's gone. What are we going to complain to God? Why did you take that blessing from me? You were complaining about it. You must have not wanted it anyway. You didn't appreciate it. We have to watch our words. We complain about the silliest stuff in the moment. And then God takes action on it because He hears His people. He responds to us. Got to be careful. So now, another part about, back to this manna, the gathering of manna was couched, it was presented in the context of the ruling of Shabbat observance. Now what am I talking about? They said you can gather manna every day, right? Not too little, not too much, because you gather too much, it would go bad, right? So you can't be greedy, you can't be selfish. But then on Shabbat Eve, you would get a double portion, right? And that wouldn't go bad, miraculously, because that way you would have enough so you didn't have to gather it on Shabbat. So it was framed in this picture of Shabbat observance. And that was another aspect of corporate unity. Just like we're unified here tonight, we're observing Shabbat together. We're unified corporately, communally, in love and care for one another. We're unified. It unifies us globally, because right now, and all over the globe, people are celebrating Shabbat. At least on this half of the globe, anyway. You know, the other guys, they'll catch up, or are they ahead of us? I don't know. Anyway, time difference. But now we're connected globally, cross-cultural lines, geographic lines, right? Ethnic lines. God's people are celebrating together. It also connects us to our past and our future. Connects us back to Exodus, right? And it also connects us to the coming millennial reign, where we'll enter our final rest. Let's look at Hebrews chapter 4. Hebrews chapter 4, verse 9. So there remains a Shabbat keeping for God's people. For the one who has entered God's rest has also rested from his own works, as God did from his. Therefore, let us do our best to enter that rest, so that no one will fall short because of the same kind of disobedience. I listened to a podcast today, and this rabbi was talking about, I guess for the last 22 years of his ministerial career, he's been focusing on bringing Orthodox Jews and Christians together, right? Trying to bridge that gap, put some common understanding. And one of the fundamental things that he does is teaches people how to have Shabbat. Not all the traditions and all that stuff, but just the concept of Shabbat, right? Of a Saturday Shabbat. And he says when people come over, when Christians see this, and just like it was for us, right? When we started keeping you remember the first time you started keeping Shabbat? Like, what is this Shabbat thing? And you checked it out and like, oh, I'm going to do that. And it was amazing. Right? It was like your faith, just everything was new. Everything was new again. It was fresh. It was exciting. It was like that romance was infused back into the relationship of your faith. And so he helps what we would say the Christians experience that. And he says, this activity, and this guy's, in what he was doing, he says this activity he truly believes is what's going to be bringing about the end of days. Not in a negative way, but this is what's going to usher in the kingdom, is God's people who love the Lord, are going to be coming back to what's in the Scriptures, to re-embracing some things that we've gotten away from historically. And Shabbat is foundational. We could say it was probably one of the first things that was instituted when the people were brought out. I'm going to meet your physical needs, but hey, we're going to do it in the context of Shabbat, because I want you to enter into my rest. And so by our obedience to Shabbat, we enter his rest. I like what that verse said. It's like, don't be disobedient. Enter into his rest. Let me find that one more time. Just want to read that. Yeah, and says, so that no one will fall short because of the same kind of disobedience. Resting from our own works. See, when we're obedient to his Shabbat, when we set that time apart for him, That's when we enter into his rest. We all done it. We've all had things that we've gotten ourselves involved in on Shabbat, and it's not restful. It's not. And then Shabbat comes and goes, and then maybe we kind of feel like, it just wasn't that great. Right? Because we never entered in. I'll be the first one to say, I don't like to be legalistic about anything. There's times where maybe stuff is going on and you give your attention to other things. We have to understand that when we do that, we're not going to fully enter into his rest. That's the cost. Chapter 17, Exodus 17. Now we have this picture of disunity. Testing and quarreling. So the people have moved, they're camping at Rephidim, and here they cry out for water again, right? And they're on the middle of the desert, water's a big deal. And they grumble to Moses. Ultimately, God provides for their need, yet the place is called Massah and Meribah, testing and arguing. See, their hardness of heart was revealed in that situation. And they questioned being brought out of Egypt. Let's look at chapter 17, verse 3. It says, the people quarreled with Moshe, demanding, give us water to drink. But Moshe replied, why pick a fight with me? Why are you testing Adonai? However, the people were thirsty for water there and grumbled against Moshe, for what did you bring us up out of Egypt? To kill us, our children and our livestock with thirst? Pressure, testing, hard times, difficult situations and circumstances, all these things will come to bear on us and they will reveal the contents of our heart every time. The people just saw at Marah, right? The bitter waters were made sweet. God provided. Prior to that, the waters parted. They came across dry land. The enemy was swallowed up. God provided. We needed bread in the wilderness. God provided. So here we are. Okay, we're in the desert. We're thirsty again. And there's still bitterness. There's still quarreling in our heart. Their hardness of heart was revealed. And they begin to show where their allegiances lie. Man, I know I was in bondage in Egypt, but I had water. I had meat. I know, Lord, you don't want me to take that mark, but man, I'm going to lose my internet. Right? And we laugh about it, but I know you don't want me to take that mark, but now I can't work. I might lose my job. I know you're calling me to step out in faith, but that might give up my comfort and security. What's in our heart? Sometimes we don't even know. And it takes hard circumstances before we can figure it out, because that will expose it. And maybe that's one of the reasons why God allows his people to go through hard circumstances. To see what's in your heart. If we think about it, that's a grace. Because he says he will never leave us nor forsake us. So we can go through something hard and difficult knowing he'll be there with us, but use that situation to expose what's in our heart so we can make the correction. When we complain, we speak against God by doubting. Chapter 17, verse 7. The place was named Massah, testing, and Meribah, quarreling. because of the quarreling of the people of Israel and because they tested Adonai by asking, is Adonai with us or not? I'm thirsty, Lord. I'm in the desert. Are you even here? Do you forget about us? We're doubting God. And it revealed what was in their heart. We reveal our attachments and our insecurities. God may respond by addressing our hard-hearted desires. And often that doesn't look like we would expect. Remember the issue with the quail, right? God, we need meat. You want meat? I'm going to give you so much meat you're going to choke on it. That old adage, careful what you wish for. And as we stated earlier, a complaint about a blessing could lead to the loss of that blessing. The chapter closes with the attack from the Amalekites. Right? Now, the act of complaining gives spiritual access to the enemy to harass you. You've opened the door. You've publicly stated, I'm doubting the Lord and I'm disregarding His provision for me. In the case of complaining about a blessing. And that's all the access the enemy needs to get in and start working in your life. You want to spew negativity, ingratitude, reveal attachments to ungodly things? The enemy's going to have a field day with that. And so what happens to the people? They're attacked. Seemingly out of nowhere. Complaining is an act of faithlessness, and it's often a rejection of God's provision. Now, the disunity of the people, the disunity was corrected during the battle. Again, a hard circumstance. Now you got to fight. Now you're in it. Now it's do or die time. You better be unified when you're getting attacked. Right? What happens to us when we go through hard things and we want to isolate ourselves? When we need the support of our community. When we need the support of those in the faith with us. Well, during this battle, the people had to be unified. Now, Moses being the leader, it said that when he would hold his hands up, the people would prevail in the battle. Right? But then he'd get tired. You know? It's a lot of proverbial weight there. Right? Being the leader of all these people. Leading the charge, so to speak. You know? And he gets tired. And so when his arms would come down, people would start to lose the battle. Now Aaron and Hur joined together holding up Moses' arms, which was another picture of unity. All right, I know you're the head, I know you're the leader, we're not going to let you stand alone. We are going to be your support system because as you stand, so do the people. And they won. They were unified at what we would say a leadership level, right? Preachers always like to use those terms. But they were unified and that trickled down to the people. They're unified, we can be unified. And we're going to fight and we're going to win. And they did. To commemorate the victory, Moses built an altar naming it Adonai Nisi. The Lord is my banner. Right? He's my standard. He's my ensign. And it's interesting because Moses' arms symbolize God's representation, God's banner over Israel. Because the people said, I know God is with him, and so if he's holding his arms up, God's with us. We can win this fight. Now we'll leave the people there. We're going to leave them in the wilderness after the battle. We're going to look at our half-Torah in Judges chapter 4 through 5:31. It's basically the story of the Canaanite general Sisera and his armies who were fighting with Israel, and they were swept away by the Kishon River, right? So we have another battle, and we have the enemy being swept away by a body of water. This is interesting because we have the resulting song of praise by Deborah, which parallels Moses' song and Miriam's song, right? So it's kind of like a one-for-one all these years later. Now Deborah was a prophetess, and she summoned Barak to undertake the battle with Sisera. But now he refused to go without Deborah. Now this is some interesting things here, because a lot of times we give Barak a hard time. We're like, well, how come he had to take a woman with him? Right? Yeah, he's the soldier, he's the warrior. And then what does she tells him? She says, I'll go with you, but if you're going to do this, if you're going to have me come with you, then the honor that you would have received by winning the battle, that's going to go to somebody else. You're going to forfeit that. Which is really interesting, because now it opens up all these things in our mind, like, well, was he, was he kind of a beta male? Was he not the alpha that we all think he is? Or, what was going on? And who is Deborah? Why did she get to go? And all this kinds of stuff. And we start doubting the characters and, assigning different things, our own presuppositions to this whole story. But we have to keep in mind Barak. One, if a prophetess comes and says, look, I need you to go fight this battle and go get, 10,000 men or 20,000 men? I forget the exact number. So Barak was somebody who was able to summon large groups of fighting men, right? He wasn't just Joe Nobody, for starters. Deborah was a prophetess and a judge in a time where there weren't many judges, right? And so she was God's person in that space and time. And so Barak says, look, I'm willing to do this. I'm willing to fight. I'm willing to go, but I want God's person with me. Right? We would say, I want God's man with me. Well, she happened to be a woman. Fine. I'm not going without the Lord's banner, right? Without the symbol of his presence coming with me. So they won the battle, and the river washed the enemy away. Nobody survived except for Sisera, the general. And what happens to the general? He flees. He runs away. He's like, okay, I just got whooped. Everybody's dead. I'm out. And so he's on the run. And he comes to the tent of Jael, the wife of Heber, and he's like, can I crash here? I need a place to hide. She's like, yeah, that's cool. I'll hide you. He's like, if anybody comes asking if anybody's here, tell them nobody's here. Oh, cool. Chill out. We can get you some food. We'll get you set up, get you comfortable. And so he's cool. He's like, I'm chilling. I'm hidden. I'm chilling. And so he lies down and goes to sleep. And then Jael, the wife, she takes a tent stake. Now, I don't know if you've ever seen any Bedouin-style tents. We're not talking the little camping tent stakes that you get, at Walmart in the camping section. We're talking a tent stake, right? And she takes it and she drives it, hammers it through his head, right through his temple, right into the ground, pins him there. He's gone. And then people come and they find him. He says, he's in the tent. He very did. And so that kind of fulfilled that prophetic utterance from Deborah, saying that, look, this glory is going to go to a woman, because this righteous lady took out the enemy of God's people. Interesting story. Our Brit Hadashah is in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. verses 1 through 5. It says, "For brothers, I don't want you to miss the significance of what happened to our fathers. All of them were guided by the pillar of cloud, and they all passed through the sea. And in connection with the cloud and with the sea, they all immersed themselves into Moshe. Also, they all ate the same food from the Spirit, and they all drank the same drink from the Spirit, for they drank from a Spirit-sent rock which followed them, and that rock was the Messiah. Yet, with the majority of them, God was not pleased, so their bodies were strewn across the desert." Now, we know what happened. They walked with God. They got the commandments. They went from this, I'm going to serve today, I'm going to rebel tomorrow, I'm going to serve today, I'm going to rebel tomorrow, this whole cycle. And the whole generation died in the wilderness. They never entered the promised land. It was the next generation that entered the promised land. And just like we talked earlier about when we bless our children, right? Why does God give children to disobedient people? Because that's a chance for that bloodline to be redeemed. That's a chance for that next generation to walk into the promised land. And the enemy does everything he can to stop that from happening. You know, we like to call it familiar spirits. 90% of familiar spirits is learned behavior. Passed down from generation to generation to generation to generation. Because it's the enemy's way of stopping that person from fulfilling any kind of godly calling in their life. Keep them in bondage, keep them enslaved, keep them in Egypt. Now if we look at verse 2 here, 1 Corinthians 10, verse 2. "And in connection with the cloud and the sea, they all immersed themselves into Moshe." The people, into Moses, into Moshe. The people were unified under one law, right? They were given the commandments, they were given the Torah, they were given the mitzvot. They were unified as one body of people under one law. And then it goes on to talk about the manna. The manna was spiritual bread, right? It came down from heaven. It was miraculous. And yet we have Yeshua, who is the bread of life. John 6. All who believe in Yeshua will receive living water. Right? He says, all you come to me who thirst, and I will give you living water. And he is the rock of our salvation. Just like they hit the rock and the water came out. Verse 5. "Yet with the majority of them God was not pleased, so their bodies were strewn across the desert." Grumbling, and this was one of the lessons that I learned from this Torah portion for me personally, is that grumbling and complaining are gateways into faithlessness. It's a sign of ingratitude and disbelief. And if we bring these things to its logical conclusion, you'll end up in faithlessness. God can't do that. First you'll go from God can't do that for me to just God can't do that. Those without faith cannot enter into his promised land. Grumbling and complaining, taken to their logical conclusion of faithlessness, will leave you dead and buried in the wilderness. And you will not enter the promised land. We're not even talking about salvation here. What's your life going to be like when you're in this physical body? While you're still alive and breathing on this planet, what do you want your life to be like? Do you want it to be riddled with bitterness and complaining, discontent, and then take that to your grave? It's a horrible existence. trying to remember a quote. It was from a minister who has sadly fallen far away from the Lord. I'm probably getting it wrong, but it was basically like you can't see the good in anything, right? And because you can't see the good in anything, your life becomes a living hell. No. But a complaining spirit, it'll lead you away from the Lord. So in closing, the strength of community is directly related to its unity. We call ourselves messianics, Torah observant, followers of the way, whatever label you want to put on our group, those who believe like we do. But how much infighting is there? Right? We go to war over calendars. We laugh about it all the time. But it's really not that funny. Right? People they'll break fellowship over it. Right? Or you're saying the Lord's name wrong. Right? This is how you pronounce it. Because we're all linguistic experts, apparently. Right? We break fellowship over it. I've been hearing a couple of groups, if you do, like we like to do some of the traditional things, some of the Judaic traditional things as part of our liturgy, for lack of a better word. And there's other groups, if you do that, they will not have fellowship with you. You're doing that Jewish stuff. We break fellowship. We're disunified. The strength of a community is only as strong as its weakest link. And if we can't link together, even with disagreement, this is all peripheral stuff. Nobody's arguing about the deity of the Lord or any of this kind of stuff. No, it's just all this peripheral issues. How you pronounce it? Are you kidding me? Mr. English-speaking guy, right? Ask the African dude, or the dude from Belgium or Norway how to say it. You're going to break fellowship over that? Are you kidding me? Complaining and disunity, they also misrepresent God. This is why a lot of other people, a lot of Christians, see groups like this. And what do they see? They look online, right? Man, I've been hearing about this Shabbat stuff. I've been hearing about these festivals. This sounds amazing. I'm seeing it in Scripture. We're going to hook up with some people that believe like that. Oh, hey, there's this online group on Facebook. Let me jump in that and see what they got to say. Bad representation, man. They're going to take one look at that and be like, whoa, I'm going to church on Sunday. They're not doing that mess. So as a body, if we can't overcome the fleshly desires that cause strife, we will always be opposed to one another. I heard this thing this week. This minister was talking about. He's like, you look at all the disunity. He was talking about denominations and kind of the he was a Western mindset type guy. But he made a good point. He says, there was that passage where the disciples were asking the Lord, hey Lord, who's the greatest? Who's the greatest among us? Right? Is it me? Is it him? Who's the greatest? You can tell me. Who's the greatest? Which one's your favorite? Right? He says, we do this today. That's essentially what we're doing. We're asking, who's the greatest? Is my denomination the greatest, Lord? Is this group that I'm a part of the greatest, Lord? You can tell me. We'll keep it our secret. Right? We're still petty infighting. It's just fleshly desires that cause strife. And when we do this, we work against the mutual benefit and against God's kingdom plan. And we give sway to the enemy of our souls. We give him a playground and an open door. Come on in and play. Do whatever you want. So our job is to strive to cease complaining and reject all forms of disunity among our members. So we don't have to have agreement to have unity. We can have unity and have disagreement. Right? Now, there's standards, right? There's certain core issues that we just, if there's disagreement there, then there can't be fellowship. That's pretty rare, though. All this peripheral stuff, right? You say Yehoshua and I say Yahshua and whatever. Okay, fine. We can still worship together. We can still be part of one body linked together. Right? Same like complaining. And this is for me, because I can complain in a minute. Just stupid stuff. Right? Walk through my garage and there's clutter in there. Gosh, Lord, it's so tough having all these possessions. Right? Yes. Terrible that I have to pick up after myself because you've blessed me with all this material goods. Why am I complaining? I mean, it's like in the moment you don't think about it, but you just step back and just think about what you're complaining about. And that's what I've been trying to do, and that's really helped me to complain less. So I'm like, that's just dumb to complain about certain stuff like that. And it dishonors God. So why do it? So for me, my challenge to you all is, let's focus on what we say. Not complaining, being more gracious, being more thankful for the things that we have. Because we all know, we can look around us and we know we could have it a lot worse than what we do. So that are my thoughts from this week's Torah portion, Beshalach, and I hope it was a blessing to you and that you got something out of it this week. And with that, I will say Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.